What does it mean to be perfect? What does it mean to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother? What does it mean to make sure that everything that comes out of your mouth, everything that you say, fits a specific image? It's daunting. But yet, so many women around the world carry this narrative and story. But today, my guest, Tracy, better known as the Bad Indian Therapist, challenges this myth specifically for South Asian women. She focuses on the perfect Indian girl. Through her therapy practice, her online course, Break Free from Toxic Guilt, and her community, Misfit Chat House, Tracy helps South Asian women question the stories they've inherited about shame, self-sacrifice, and what it means to be good. This I 100% relate to. We dive in about so much around what it means to put parents on a pedestal, what it means to be internally conflicted between multiple cultures that you carry. And her work isn't about rejecting culture. In fact, it's about reclaiming authenticity. She gives permission to take up space, set boundaries, and resist the quiet erosion that happens when fear of being bad keeps you from being real. And in this conversation, we'll unpack the myths of the perfect Indian girl, talk about guilt as both a cultural tool and a personal burden, and explore why redefining empathy and boundaries may be the most radical act of love for yourself, for your family, and for your community. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives, the podcast where we challenge traditional thinking and explore the power of empathy in conscious leadership, personal growth, and human connection. I'm Dr. Payal Beri, and in each episode, we dive into thought-provoking conversations that expand perspectives and spark transformation. Because empathy reframes perspectives. Let's begin. Hi, Tracy. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited to talk to you because, first of all, I found you on TikTok. That's where I found you. And I was like, been following you for at least a year. And being Indian, being a former clinical therapist, being in this space, everything you were saying, I literally was like, I feel like she's talking directly to me. I'm so excited to actually have a conversation directly with you. But before we dive into everything that you have been building and doing and sharing and educating, I want you to share what drove you to wanting to share and talk about the perfect Indian girl or labeling yourself as like the bad Indian therapist.
Yeah, I actually didn't go into this field thinking that I was going to work with, South Asian American clients anyway. That was never my intention to begin with. So I didn't go into this field thinking like, yes, I'm going to start a private practice. I'm going to market myself as the bad Indian therapist. I'm going to be the therapist for perfect Indian girls. Like I never intentionally marketed that. But it just so happened that throughout the course of my career, there would be like one or two clients of that background who felt really drawn to me because they were looking for something different. And it wasn't something that I kind of tapped into. And it was then that I kind of realized that oftentimes the South Asian clients who were drawn to me were South Asian clients who often felt like they couldn't go to anybody else of their culture because of the fear of judgment, the fear that other therapists of the diaspora were going to hold them to cultural standards of what it means to belong. So because I wasn't actively like, here I am, I'm a South Asian therapist, I feel like there were South Asian clients who were drawn to me for that reason because they could tell that I wasn't necessarily subscribing to the culture, that perhaps I was like quote unquote whitewashed or Western enough to be quote unquote non-judgmental, which that could also carry a wide array of connotations too, right? And I just kind of one thing that struck out to me when I was getting my bachelor's degree and a master's degree is that they were like, I can't remember the specific study, but I'm pretty sure it was the same study. And I don't know if it's been qualified yet with multiple studies, but there was a study in Canada of specifically Indian Canadian women who would not go to Indian Canadian gynecologists because of the same thing, the fear of judgment, the fear of gossip spreading. It was something that my program coordinator, who was the head professor of my counseling psychology program at Teachers College, Columbia, she even said the same thing. And she's of Indian descent, that like a lot of her experience is that a lot of Indian clients, and then again, that's her experience. I don't know if this is true, but that Indian clients would prefer not to go to somebody of their culture. And in my early days of my Instagram, I pulled that, and there were several women who answered and said yes, they were kind of afraid. And I think because so much of our culture is used to kind of justify patriarchy, a lot of South Asian women who have really tried to kind of resist patriarchal cultural norms are so like, I don't want anything to do with that, which could also be considered a trauma response. So I call it perfect Indian girl syndrome. Some people may call it eldest daughter syndrome. I feel like that's too broad. I'm very specific because there's also very unique cultural systems at play that place the emphasis on specifically Indian women to not only carry the family reputation, but to carry the bloodline of the caste. And that's like something that's really taboo and nobody wants to talk about. But that's why I also call it perfect Indian girl syndrome, because there is an expectation that you are supposed to carry the culture on your backs. So yeah, that's why I call it perfect Indian girl syndrome. It's not a real thing, but that's kind of how I came to be the bad Indian therapist.
I think that you actually calling it the perfect Indian girl actually helps a lot because, I'm not the eldest, but I resonate with a lot of the things because I think just being an Indian girl, there's so
Yeah.
much placed on you, right? I think a lot of Indian girls, even growing up here in the United States, can say that you get home from high school, right? And
Mhm.
you drop your bag or you put your shoes on the side, and immediately the response is, "Oh, are you gonna do that when you get married? Are you gonna do that when, you have kids? Like, or when I come to your home, I'm gonna do the right."
Mhm.
There's these immediate responses that everything that you do in your life from the day that you are conscious is in grooming and training to be a married woman to somebody else. Is someone who's going to carry the dignified, reputable respect. This is how a woman is.
Mhm.
And that same reasoning is not placed on your brothers or the sons of the family. I'm curious, even, as you mentioned, and I've seen this also with my friends, maybe they won't go to like a white therapist, but they'll go to someone who's like culturally adjacent. And
Mhm.
so, they may go to someone who is Middle Eastern, or they'll go to somebody who is, Jewish or someone because there still has some relation
Yeah.
to what it looks like, but they won't go
Right.
to the Indian. So even
Mhm.
that idea of there's so much conversation now about therapists who have cultural competency so that they feel more aware about who they're talking to and can have that relevance. Do
Right.
you feel then that that relevance of that cultural competency gets used in a way that is then I, as a, for example, non-Indian, learned cultural competency about what it's like to be South Asian, and now I'm setting the bar even for those Indian patients that are coming through?
Yeah, I feel like my thoughts on the whole cultural competency conversation is that I think that a lot of therapists don't even really know what that means, to be honest. And that's something that's also really hard to define. And I find that like South Asian therapists think that cultural competency means that you have to be the spiritual guru who's taking your clients on a faraway journey to an exotic land far, far away. And it's like, you don't have to be on loan from the British Museum. Your job is not to protect the culture. And I think a lot of South Asian therapists, they feel this pressure to protect the culture, especially online. And there's a lot of talk about like the grad school and the ills of grad school and whatnot. But what learned in grad school and also in my time before I even went into private practice, when I was practicing as a therapist, collecting my clinical hours, is that cultural competency really speaks to your ability to understand and be sensitive to cultural norms that can serve as barriers to mental health, right? And also identifying cultural norms that can be used as strengths to benefit mental health as well, right? It doesn't mean you have to uphold these cultural norms as truth. It doesn't mean that you have to hold your clients to those cultural standards, but maybe being aware of what may be harder for your client because of cultural barriers and what cultural strengths can be used to further their progress towards goals, right? That's my understanding of, having gone to grad school, what I learned at teachers college. Also, like I used to work in a nonprofit field. I worked for two nonprofits actually. And like a lot of what I did was giving home based family therapy. I would go to people's homes and like Jamaica Queens and Ozone Park, and we're working with, like, Indo-Caribbean families, right? And, there's a lot of conflict in the home. My understanding of cultural competency is that, like, I don't have to be
Yeah.
this expert on Indo-Caribbean culture and what's allowed and what's not allowed and hold my clients to that, but I at least have to be aware of what's informing the process in the session, right? Like, that's my understanding. I feel like some South Asian therapists, they really think they're supposed to be cultural gurus. And it's like, if you want to do that, that's fine. Maybe there is a client who could really benefit from that, but that's not my MO. That doesn't make or break whether or not I'm a good or a bad therapist. I can be informed, but that doesn't have to be my practice.
Yeah. And there's so much of even that through line of the cultural elements of, again, just being simply aware. It's like, that's all it is doing. It's like, okay, I recognize and being aware of this, but that idea of even saying South Asians are collectively this culture is taking away the fact that we're not even a monolithic group.
Mhm.
And that even within the, South Asian diaspora, like, I mean, first of all, you've got different countries that are coming into this space. And then if we take India alone,
Right.
every region has its own language, it has its own food, it has its own belief systems. Like these were kingdoms that were just collectively put together at one point.
Right.
And so now you're asking me, for example, to be like, oh, yeah, my cultural competency of what it means to be a perfect Indian girl is the same as you, Tracy, when we may belong to completely different regions. I'd love to learn from you about when you are talking to your patients and your clients on what it means to be the perfect Indian girl. But there's this spectrum of those who've just immigrated here, those
Yeah.
who came with parents who immigrated. Like myself, I came here when I was like 9 or 10, but I didn't ever live in India. I'm a third culture kid. So I grew up in the Middle East and I grew up in Australia and I grew up like in the East Coast before settling in the West Coast. But so even my belonging of what it means to be Indian is like, I'm not Indian enough for my very deeply Indian family, or I'm too Indian for my friends who were born and raised here, or their families have been here since the 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
So even that through line of like what it means to be a perfect Indian girl, I I can imagine it really does go even deeper into the family dynamic of that individual, not just like their cultural element.
I think that there's so much to be said about the impact of westernization and immigration on what it means to belong. And I think it's also important to note that it's not just one story, it's multiple stories, right? I think sometimes what I'm noticing, especially on like Instagram and social media, we're speaking a lot about the impact of this one specific story of westernization and immigration that kind of paints a very infantilizing view of India and the South Asian subcontinent as like Eastern and that we are Western. And it's like the divide between the Occident, which is the West, and the Orient, which is the East, right? And while it is important to acknowledge the differences, sometimes hyper focusing on those differences, we accidentally contribute to what is called New Age Orientalism. We reorientalize the South Asian subcontinent into being this monolithic thing. And the one narrative I keep hearing is like, when our parents immigrated here, it was in the 80s and they hold on really tightly to their values from back in India during the 80s. And that is true. And that's true for a lot of Desi people, right? But I think sometimes we think that that is the one part of our story as a collective when really yes, a lot of, South Asian immigrants came here in the 80s, post civil rights movement, post segregation. I think it's the Immigrant Act of 1965. Yes, there was a huge wave that came in the 80s. But what's a lesser known fact is that there actually was an influx of Indian immigrants who came in the 1800s and the early 1900s to help build the California railroad system. And in fact, some of these earlier migrants helped fight for a free, independent India in the US. They helped fight the British while living in the US. And that's something that doesn't get talked about, right?
Right.
Like in California, you have people who have been there for a very long time, who
Yeah.
and even in some parts of Canada as well, Indian people who have ancestors that have been here since the 1900s may even be of mixed backgrounds. So I feel like when we talk about like westernization and immigration, we have to remember that these are very broad concepts. And if we're too broad with it and we're too fixated on it, we run the risk of re and orientalizing ourselves and making us just one narrative and one story.
Yeah. No, and to your point about those individuals that have been here since the 1800s, I mean, yeah, there's an entire area in San Jose, in Yuba City that, you know, because they were actually affected by the Asian Enactment Act, they weren't allowed to bring over their wives. They weren't allowed to bring over, but they were building farmlands, a lot of Punjabis who were coming over. And they ended up marrying Mexican women because they were the closest in like cultural understanding. So you
Yeah.
have an entire group of a mixed Indian Mexican community that exists in Central
Mhm.
California because of the individuals that had come here before. So to your point, it's like there is such a focus on the new wave Indians that came in the 80s or the 90s or even the 60s who came here, when the doors were open for engineering and all the doctors and everyone came through. But with that comes this idea of what place do we have in this community? How do we now, as South Asian girls who are pressured and have this guilt of upholding this culture, but at the same time, some girls or some family members who've never even been to India. They've never even visited. They only know India through the stories that their parents or grandparents tell them and through Bollywood, maybe,
Right.
but they themselves like don't know it. And so now they're creating this rhythm and this dance of, oh yes, I'm Indian, but my whole life has been here in America. And then my community of friends is mixed. It's not just only Indians. Or when I am in Indian circles, then I feel judged or I feel I don't belong. So how do you navigate that for these Indian girls who are trying to understand their own identity, becoming this blended version of who they are?
There's so much pressure on all South Asian women to carry the culture on their backs. And there's so many past and current factors for that. Of course, there's like the factor of immigration, the fear of cultural loss. There's also the belief that women are symbols of a culture, right? Only up until very recently have we started to see like men's beauty pageants for countries, right? There's a reason why so many countries rely on using their women and children as an indicator of the health of a country, right? I think even Obama said something like that. That like, if you want to know the wealth of a country or how well a country is doing, look at the way that their women and children are treated, right? Like, we've had so many women's beauty pageants where you are representing an entire nation state, and we equate a nation state with cultural identity, right? So there's a lot of pressure on women to be symbols of a culture, symbols of a nation, even for Indian and South Asian women who like maybe their parents migrated here years ago or their grandparents did, and there's still pressure on them to follow these cultural expectations. It may not always be intentionally harmful. I think it's sometimes coming from the parents' fear of like, I don't want to lose sight of who we are. I don't want to lose sight of our culture. I don't want the fear of cultural erasure. But I think it also says something about why we put so much of that expectation on women specifically. I think it's important to keep in mind that culture is never static.
Mhm.
Culture is never static, and this mythical idea that prior to migrating to the West that India had this perfectly static culture. That's not true, right? In even prior to colonization and migration, like India's always had, I mean, South Asian subcontinent in general has always had evolving cultures. Culture is dynamic because people are dynamic. People are not static. People change. And I think it's also worth asking yourselves this idea of what it means to belong to the culture, what it means to be cultural, what it means to be Indian enough. Are those oral stories even accurate? Or is that just like a fantasy that we've kind of built up in our head because we want to feel culturally enough?
Yeah. What are your thoughts then about holding on to this piece of, like you said, like culture is constantly evolving, and we're seeing that happen, today in our society, like the evolution that's happening more towards conservatism. But when we're seeing that, do you think then that as you help your clients release that identity of being the perfect Indian girl, is part of that also having them accept and be okay with, I'm okay with not having to carry on this identity or this legacy of this cultural norms that aren't even beneficial to me? Or like when I think about raising my daughter, I don't want her to center her life around your entire validation is by validating by, did you get married? Did you have kids? Did you have this? And not validated by your purpose, your joy and value of just being you. So is part of that allowing them to release the guilt of like, I'm okay not carrying some of that forward?
Absolutely. And I actually, I also tell my clients the more you chase something, the farther and farther you get away from it, right? When we think about like people who chase dating and relationships, it's like you're less likely to find the one. They say that like you're more likely to find the one when when you're not looking, right? The more and more you chase weight loss, the more stressed out about it, right? I can't go into the specifics of the science, but cortisol makes it harder to lose weight. If then
Right.
the more and more you chase weight loss, the harder and harder it is to lose weight. The more and more you try to chase being culturally enough, the farther and farther you get away from it. And I actually think that when we take the pressure off of women to be symbols of a culture, they're more likely to have full and meaningful relationships with people in their cultural community that gives them permission to also be themselves. You're setting a precedent for your cultural community. You're allowing them to develop their own unique relationship to culture without the pressure of fitting somebody else's expectations. When we force women to fit these very rigid roles and, not have boundaries, not take care of themselves, you get resentful mothers, you get resentful aunties, you get resentful sisters, you create traumatic experiences for people in their lives, right? Like that doesn't do service to anyone. So I think that when we give permission to South Asian women to let go of the good girl conditioning and to really be able to say, fuck it, I'm going to do what I want. The guilt may always be there. The survivor's guilt may always be there, but I'm not going to let that stop me from my desires. You empower everybody else around you, and it's healing to everyone else around you too.
What does it mean to go from being this identity of the perfect Indian girl to actually just being someone who gets to just be myself? Like what is that, journey like for that client, for that person? Because I find that there's so much that happens just within decentering that identity. You're going to, the loss of like friendships, maybe tension that gets created because now by you shifting your identity, the people around you are having to possibly shift theirs. You're not forcing them, but it's like that relationship is going to change. And if that other person is unwilling to see that growth, then yeah, there may be loss.
I think that's so much of just like this work in general. I mean, all of this comes back to what the purpose of therapy is that you have to expand your capacity to feel. And that includes sitting with emotional discomfort. And we work so hard to try and push these uncomfortable emotions away. I know I talk a lot about guilt and shame. I have an entire course that's about breaking free from toxic guilt. But I hope I'm never conveying the idea that you're just supposed to make guilt go away. The whole idea is that you shouldn't let guilt dictate or be the driver's seat in every single one of your decisions. And when that starts to become the driver, that's when it can become problematic. But that's not to suggest that we need to push guilt away. More like we have to understand our relationship to it. And that's going to come out when you have to have hard conversations with people. And in a culture where we fear open conflict, especially because we come from households where open conflict often can be very explosive, very volatile, sometimes even violent, we're afraid of the same thing happening when, okay, I'm going to change for the betterment of myself. This is bound to disappoint people that I care about a lot, but that's not necessarily something that you should avoid. You can still have conversations with people who are disappointed. You can allow them to be disappointed without letting go of your boundary. We can hold space for other people's emotions. People are allowed and entitled to their own emotions, but that doesn't mean that you have to change what you're doing to make their emotions go away, right? The goal is to not make bad emotions go away. We're not trying to make your guilt go away. We're also not trying to make their feelings of disappointment go away. They are entitled to their feelings, right? Our job is to not make that go away. This is how we learn to adjust. And yeah, that may mean having to have uncomfortable conversations that require a lot of patience and letting go of this idea that there needs to be an outcome. We can allow ourselves to have different difficult conversations with people we love where we're still very firm about like what we're not willing to do, but that we still deeply care about that person. And that it doesn't have to come to a resolution right away. We could just let things just be. We can let things just exist. We all have our own emotional process.
I think so much of that also just speaks to, and you touched on that, is like in the culture, there's this idea of you don't bring things up. And if you do bring things up, you're difficult. And it totally gets under my skin because I am someone who will bring things up. But
Mhm.
I do see that relationship where it's almost like someone who does have a more direct communication style gets gaslit to think that they're the difficult one, they're the challenging one because they are expressing, they are bringing up, and they're trying to create clarity in the relationship. But the other person who doesn't have the capacity to hold it,
Mhm.
that's been normalized to look as that is the peacekeeper. That's the one who's, well, I don't have conflict, it's okay. Like I'm so easygoing. And it creates this idea that the clear communication is actually aggressive or conflictive,
No.
especially from a brown girl
Yes.
versus the one who is passive, might talk to a vent to other people about it, but will never actually like hold a space to have those clear communications.
Yeah, and that's kind of actually the most frustrating thing about this whole boundaries conversation that's happening online right now is that like we're getting so hung up on how to communicate a boundary, what's the best way to communicate a boundary with our immigrant parents that we don't even realize that we're engaging in tone policing. Like how much of
Mhm.
this is effective communication and how much of this is actually tone policing racialized women who have been told their whole lives that not being in service to others makes them a quote unquote bitch. Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, go
Okay.
for it.
Yeah. Uh-huh. So I think that like just because we are a diaspora that is used to indirect communication does not mean that indirect communication is the only effective way to communicate. It doesn't mean that we can't benefit from direct communication. And this is something that I've noticed as a therapist in this diaspora as well is that, like, actually, I do have some clients, particularly clients who identify as men, who actually really respond well to more direct forms of therapy, like rational emotive behavioral therapy, sometimes even DBT. Like, sometimes we can benefit from more direct forms of therapy, direct forms of communicating therapeutic interventions, because not only do they lead to change, but it also kind of motivates us to see that things can be different. It doesn't have to always be this one way. I have found that way too many of us, including myself, we're getting hung up on how to communicate, that we're not really focusing on identifying what shared values we have with the person in front of us and letting go of the outcome and focusing more on the process of just really being with that person. You can still hold to yourself and you can still honor the fact that you can't change that person and how they feel about it. Like, the reality is that so long as you are a South Asian woman, somebody out there is gonna think that you're a bitch because you're saying no. You can't change that, right? You cannot control the narrative. When you get hung up on controlling the narrative, you've lost, right? It's not your job to convince people who are set on misunderstanding you. If somebody is set on thinking that you're a bitch, like, you gotta just, I don't wanna say let them, but you gotta honor the fact that that's how they feel, right? Like,
Right.
let them be with that emotional process, let them come to terms with their own realizations of whatever that may be, give them the grace to feel that, as hurtful as it is, and make sure you have your own squad of people to reaffirm for you that, "No, you are not a bitch, you are very deserving."
Yeah. I
Mhm.
find that, so much of, growing up with that idea, you constantly hear about, well, what would people say? What will people say? Right. And that's such a common thing that you hear from aunties, from parents, from uncles, whoever it is. And so every decision is led with this image in mind and that reputation in mind. And also, I do think that we're so outcome driven as a community. What education are you getting? What degree did you get? What, school did you get into? All of those things. It's very outcome driven. So being raised in a culture where I find it actually really ironic and kind of hilarious that there's so much talk always about like, oh, our beautiful Indian culture, and we care so much about relationships and our sanskar, like our good ethics and morals.
Mhm.
But if you actually look at our actions, they have nothing to do with, like, we put this whole Vedic history and like, all this stuff on this, like, on this pedestal, but then when you look at the individuals who are living it out, there is so much materialism and status and outside external validation that is informing everything they're doing, that even you considering the perfect Indian girl or the perfect Indian family, you're living so out of alignment with actually what our cultural ancient
Right.
wisdoms propose that we live within, but we want to claim it like, oh, but look at, we belong to this.
I got into a lot of trouble on TikTok saying this, but so much of Indian culture as we know it is actually white supremacy culture. And I said that you don't have to be white to have a white supremacist mindset. It's all around us. We kind of have to subscribe to it a little bit in order to survive. And if you come from a group of people that has ever been colonized by Europeans, you likely have this too. A lot of people got mad at me on TikTok for saying that.
I could not
But
agree more with you.
but it's true, right? When you think about the tenets of a white supremacist mindset or a white supremacy culture, the one right way, the idea that there's one right way to be Indian, worship of the written word, because it's written in our sacred texts, you have to subscribe to this. Perfectionism, instant gratification, all or nothing thinking, right? Like, we need outcomes. We need outcomes right away. If I'm not going to be able to do this, that means I'm that. Right? So much of our shame and guilt comes from white supremacy's impact on our culture. So we speak very vaguely and very generally about how great this Eastern culture that we come from is. But in actuality, even when Indian people do community, we're still very individualistic about it. And it's something that, people have brought up to me is that, like, we always say that Western society is transactional, but Indian people are just as transactional in their relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to that point of how much has been taken, if you look at some of the stigmas that we hold around mental health or stigmas that we hold around even I'll go out and say, like, our relationship and what we think about with homosexuality, right? Like, all of
Mhm,
that has been adopted
mhm,
by Western communities. If you go back thousands of years, whatever you want to say, like in our texts, there's scripts, there's always been an actual invitation
mhm.
and recognition of the LGBTQ community. And so, this idea notion that we don't have that, I think even that part is so much internalized hate and so much internalized, just complete denial of we need to be accepted by the group that is the majority that's going to say, yes, you are validated. And
Mhm,
so that in turn, I can imagine are like those individuals that have not understood how they're consciously acting
mhm.
probably came after you, but you're not saying anything that isn't factual. So
Thank you. I appreciate that. Sometimes there are moments where I question myself because I'm like, damn, like none of the other South Asian therapists I know are necessarily talking about this or talking about this to the same degree I am. So am I doing something wrong? Right.
no, I
And
think you're just bringing up something that's really that either they just don't wanna go there because they're protecting their own
safety.
story
Yeah. Yeah.
and safety, and I think that even to really consider living in the US, being a South Asian therapist, it's still a relatively, I would say, newer, accepted, like, career path,
Mhm,
and I remember when I got my degree, what, 15 years ago, whatever it was, it was still this idea of like, "Oh, didn't realize
mhm,
it's a thing," and it was still accepted for, like, girls to go into it, but not
mhm,
necessarily like the guys to go
mhm,
into and become therapists. But you
mhm.
got to wonder again, right? Why are South Asian women turning into psychologists and therapists? It's, often to even just heal their own stuff that they're going through.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case for therapists in general, you know?
Absolutely.
And there's so many reasons why we see more South Asian women going into this field than South Asian men. Historically, this is not a field that is known for paying very well. It's emotional labor. We associate emotional labor with
With
women's
women.
work, right? So, like, most therapists are women. And most therapists are women who have been through their own trauma. And it's no secret that therapists are also huge people pleasers, right? If I can't even imagine bigger people pleasers than therapists. And when we talk about like the fear of what will people think and the fear of what will people say, in the South Asian diaspora, it's so funny to me because I feel like even therapists across all ethnicities have that fear of what will people think, what will people say. And I see this all the time when it comes to what is considered ethical or unethical, even though the code of ethics may not even say that, right? This fear that therapists have about what it means to market yourself,
Mhm.
take up space, raise your rates, have a niche, like expanding outside of one to one therapy. Therapists across all ethnicities, white, black, you name it, they also have a fear of what will people think, what will people say, because you do have those therapists who will shout, that's unethical at anything and everything that they disagree with. Meanwhile, the ACA code of ethics doesn't even say it's unethical. It actually suggests that you have permission to do whatever you want when it comes to this area. So like there's so much fear even in the therapist community of the guilt and shame of what will people think, what will people say. This isn't something that's specific to the South
Mhm.
Asian diaspora. I think that like when you are a South Asian woman and you become a therapist and you become a therapist who runs your own private practice and you have your own online space, like you almost re-traumatize yourself because you're re-experiencing those that same thing over again, not just by random South Asian strangers on the internet, but also by like random therapist strangers who've got their own self-defeating beliefs and fears around what it means to be a therapist in today's world. So there's parallels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I agree that it's across everything. And, there's a couple things in there. One is the fact that being a therapist, a lot of times you'll see therapists that are great therapists, but oftentimes because they're so passionate and focused on their clients, they are using that as a way to distract themselves from doing their own work. And so they're often not, but yet they're able to process and be a great therapist and just keep all the attention external of them. So when then they are being held accountable to anything, or they see something out there that triggers something they haven't worked through, it causes all this riff. And I actually find it really fascinating. When I was working as a clinical therapist in New York, doing home-based counseling, all of it, working at nonprofits, it's really disheartening to see how much trauma and toxicity exists just within the industry
Of
itself.
course. Yeah.
And that's a whole other conversation that we can dive into another time. But
Mhm.
the second layer to that is, yeah, being a South Asian or an individual who is in this field, there's so much of this like morality policing that happens around what you can do, what you can say, or if someone is going and sharing a little bit more about themselves and what is expected, then all of a sudden it's like you're doing it wrong, you're doing this wrong, and all these constricts, which I can imagine, to bring it back to the South Asian already deeply ingrained system within you of like
Yeah.
how I'm supposed to operate. It's like I have to operate in these rules. Otherwise, if I don't, then I'm ostracized again.
Right. Right.
So, how do we bring that back together? Because what you mentioned about it doesn't matter what race you are, like you're still dealing with these reputation, image, all these things. And I think that there are, to your point, so many times that we talk about the perfect Indian girl, the perfect this person, whatever, but you mentioned that boundaries, for example, are not a westernized concept. This is just human, but
Right.
we tend to divide it so much. And I think it's used as a way of control,
Right.
to say that, oh, well, how could you have these kind of boundaries? Like, oh, you don't respect the values of our culture anymore. You don't do this anymore, blah, blah, blah. So, how your patients, your clients, or just in general, help educate and understand that there are just some basic skills that, regardless of what nationality, ethnicity you are, it's just beneficial to have for your own peace of mind and actually will be healthier for your relationships that we claim to be so proudful of.
Yeah. I always kind of felt like the whole boundaries are Western, boundaries aren't possible in Indian families. I find that I blame social media so much for that, for kind of creating these negative connotations and spreading misinformation, mental health misinformation. I also recognize that it's ironic that I'm a therapist who talks about boundaries on social media and I'm complaining about social media spreading this misinformation. In my personal experience, like, yes, I'm born and raised in the West, trained in Western therapy, all that. But I've never had a Western therapist tell me that boundaries mean cutting people off. That's never been my experience. I recognize that it could be somebody else's experience with maybe like a white therapist in this country. I have certainly seen white therapists suggest like cutting people off as a boundary. That's not what a boundary is. I'm not saying that cutting a person off is not a valid choice, especially if we're talking about like an abusive situation. But the whole idea of a boundary is to recognize your energy and recognizing the energy that you have in this given moment in time. That can be a permanent boundary, that can be a more temporary boundary. But to say that boundaries aren't possible in Indian families is like saying that Indian people don't have self control, that we don't have structure, that we don't have organization, that we don't have mindfulness when we literally come from the country that births spirituality. Like, to say that Indian people don't have boundaries is a really like gross misinterpretation of Indian people. And sometimes I ask my clients, I'm like, well, if that's true, what are you saying about our people? If that is true, what are you saying about our culture? And it kind of encourages them to like really pause and reconsider what they're saying. It also encourages them to get specific because the reality is that within a lot of Indian societies, certain people do get to have boundaries. We do give people in positions of power permission to have boundaries, but we don't give people who aren't in positions of power permission to have boundaries because we benefit from their free labor. And I I just feel like sometimes like I get a little aggravated with that statement because it's almost like it kind of encourages people to give up and just be like, "Oh, well, boundaries aren't possible in Indian families, so I shouldn't try." And I think it's always important to add context. Like, okay, if boundaries aren't possible in your family, is it possible that there might be some kind of abuse going on here? Before we even jump into abuse, is it possible that we're not really practicing consistency, patience, emotion regulation? Are you following through on your own boundaries? Are they confused because you're confused? They might be confused because they see that you're saying this is your boundary, but you're not following through. Your actions aren't lining up with your statements. So I don't know what to believe. There's so many things that we have to consider. And if you've done all of those things and yet nothing seems to be working, I would really explore if there might be abuse going on. Like I feel like there's so many layers to this and we can't make blanket statements like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we could have a whole conversation just about that alone
Mhm.
because it's so true. And even for someone to admit that piece, right? When you bring up the word abuse, I can see so many people saying, "What is she talking? She's being dramatic. Now she's just taking it to a whole
Mhm.
other level. Like we don't have that, you know." I've literally had extended family members say to me things like, "We Indians are just so educated and classy, and we have so much status, and we would never do things like this." Like, just such like a big reaction. And of course, I just sit there and I just like pause, I just smile, and
Mhm.
because I know in that moment, there's nothing you can say to that individual that you're just gonna create actually more, you know,
Yeah.
toxicity in that because they're just not ready to
Yeah.
even explore, get curious. They create this fixed mindset around it, and anything that is outside of that is just gonna jar them too much.
And that is a boundary, right? Learning
Right,
to not I'm not gonna have conversations with people who have that fixed mindset.
right.
That is a boundary. It's not
That's a
even a boundary that
boundary.
you have to communicate. Like, you literally just allow them to have their own emotional process, right? You don't have to waste your energy arguing. That's their truth, and it doesn't have to affect you.
Right. And if it does, that is more of your own internalized work that you have to do of why do you so badly need that person to
Mhm.
agree with you or to get their
Right.
validation, to get their acceptance, which I think goes back to this idea where I find this so often of placing parents on this pedestal. And there's that notion of parents are like your gods and you should respect them in that same level. And you see then individuals that put their parents on such a pedestal that they're unable to process the hurt, the damage, or anything. And in fact, they internalize it like they are then the problem if they are not doing things to appease to the parents' expectations because they put them on a pedestal instead of looking them as a human being who happened to have kids and came through this life with trauma of their own, just like
Right.
you will be a parent one day and you will have your own things to go through.
And I think it's also worth saying that our immigrant parents are not helpless victims. They've been through worse shit. Like, they're actually very capable. I think that when I've seen perfect Indian girls hold on so tightly to their relationship with their parents, it's important to help them know like how much of that is healthy and normal, and then how much of that is actually just avoiding grief. And I think it is healthy and normal to want to have relationships with your parents, to want your parents to love you, to want your parents to nurture you. It's healthy and normal to want to have relationships with your parents. When it gets to the point where you're clinging so tightly to relationship with your parents and hoping that they will give you the nurturance that they've never given you, the love that they've never given you, right? What we're actually avoiding is grief. We're avoiding grieving the expectations of the mother or the father we never had. And until we learn to approach that grief, we won't be able to come out on the other side of it, whatever that may be, right? Like, we have to grieve the expectations, set boundaries with their limitations, and appreciate our parents for their strengths. But if we don't grieve the expectations, we'll never get to that other side.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, I see this all the time. I mean, I know for me even, look at that of when you can actually have empathy for your parents and empathy for what they have gone through and their personal experiences, and especially for having grown up in a completely different country in a different time, and then migrating, culture shock, everything that they've had to do and adjust, and whatever their relationship and journey is with their parents, their journey with their siblings, whatever they're going through, when we can have empathy for their limitations,
Mhm.
I actually think that your relationship with them becomes even more beautiful. Like, I know
Yeah.
my relationship with my parents has become so much stronger
Mhm.
because I see them with the limitations they have, and I don't expect out of that then.
Right. Right. And empathy doesn't mean agreement, right? Like you
Right.
can
It means
understand without
understanding.
agreeing. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Well, I have one last question that I want to ask you, and it's if you could reframe one thing for all of us when it comes to the myth of being the perfect Indian girl, what would that be?
There's no such thing as a person that everybody likes.
Oh,
Th-
can you
There,
say that
there's no
again?
there, there's no such thing as a person that everybody likes. And we are all hypocrites at the end of the day. I'm not saying that you should actively try to be a hypocrite. I'm not saying don't live life according to your values, but make sure that those values are yours. Because if you are going to spend the rest of your life trying to make sure that everybody likes you and everybody agrees with you, you're going to die trying. There's no such thing as a person that everybody likes. And trying to be a person that everybody likes is really just trying to avoid feeling guilt. Would you rather feel bad for a couple of moments in your life or be resentful for a lifetime?
Wow, that's such a powerful question. Thank you so much, Tracy, for sharing, for being so open, for being so honest about the journey, because I think this is something that every girl, I will say, regardless if you're Indian or not, even could really connect with, especially with the pressures and the culture involvement that we're having now.
Mhm.
So, your perspective is something that I've always enjoyed. And regardless of the trolls coming, I hope you continue to share because I think you're saying all the things that we need to hear. And you're planting the seeds for that person who maybe isn't there yet, but they will get there. And in 2 years from now, they'll be like, ah, I get what she was saying. So, thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you for the impact you're making. And thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I loved this conversation. I love that you're starting these conversations. It's so beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. Where could people find you?
You can always find me on thebadindiantherapist.com. If you are a South Asian therapist and you are interested in getting some consultation, getting clinical supervision, I am launching my clinical supervision group for South Asian therapists in November. It's called Group Empowerment. You can visit my website and you can book your consultation call with me. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic. That's going to be so valuable. So thank you for offering that. And thank you once again.
Thank you so much.
I really hope that you enjoy this episode. And I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode. And thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.